From the complete Grimm's fairy tales, this is The Three Little Men in the Wood. There was once a man whose wife had died and a woman whose husband had died, and the man had a daughter and the woman also had a daughter. The girls were acquainted with each other and went out walking together, and afterwards came to the woman in her house. Then she said to the man's daughter, "Listen, tell your father I'd like to marry him, and then you shall wash yourself in milk every morning and drink wine, but my own daughter shall wash herself in water and drink water." The girl went home and told her father what the woman had said. The man said, "What shall I do? Marriage is a joy, but also a torment." At length, as he could come to no decision, he pulled off his boot and said, "Take this boot and put a hole into it, into the sole. Go with it up to the loft and hang it with a big nail, and then pour water into it. If it hold the water, I will take again a wife, but if it run through, I will not." The girl did as she was bid, but the water drew the hole together, and the boot came full to the top. Then she informed her father how it turned out. Then he himself went up, and when he saw that she was right, he went to the widow and wooed her, and the wedding was celebrated. The next morning, when the two girls got up, there stood for the man's daughter milk for her to wash in and wine for her to drink, but before the woman's daughter stood water to wash herself and water for drinking. On the second morning stood water for washing and water for drinking before the man's daughter as well as before the woman's daughter. And on the third morning stood water for washing and water for drinking before the man's daughter, and milk for washing and water for drinking before the woman's daughter. And so it continued. The woman became became her stepdaughter's bitterest enemy, and day by day did her best to treat her still worse. She was also envious because her stepdaughter was beautiful and lovable, while her own daughter was ugly and repulsive. Once in the winter, when everything was frozen as hard as stone, and the hill and the vale laid covered with snow, the woman put a frock of paper and called her stepdaughter. "Here, put on this dress and go into the wood and fetch me a basketful of strawberries. I have a fancy for them." "Good heavens," said the girl, "no strawberries grow in winter. The ground is frozen, and besides, the snow has covered everything. And why am I to go in this paper frock? It's so cold outside that one's breath freezes. The wind will blow through the frock, and thorns tear it off my body." "Will you contradict me?" said the stepmother. "See to it that you do not show your face again until you have a basket full of strawberries." Then she gave her a little piece of hard bread and said, "This will last you the day," and thought, "You will die of cold and hunger outside, and will never be seen by me again." Then the maiden was obedient and put on the paper frock and went out with the basket. Far and wide there was nothing but snow, not even a green blade to be seen. When she got into the wood, she saw a small house of which peeped three little men. She wished them good day and knocked modestly at the door. They cried, "Come in," and she entered the room and seated herself on the bench of the stove, where she began to warm herself and eat her breakfast. The little men said, "Give us some of it too." "Willingly," she said, and divided her piece of bread into two and gave them the half. They asked, What do you do here in the forest in the winter time in your thin dress?" "Ah," she answered, "I am looking for a basket full of strawberries. I am not to go home until I can take them with me." When she had eaten her bread, they gave her a broom and said, "Sweep away the snow at the back door." But when she went outside, the three little men said to each other, "What shall we give her, as she is so good and shared her bread with us?" The first said, "My gift is that she shall grow more beautiful every day." The second said, "My gift is gold pieces shall fall from her mouth every time she speaks." And the third said, "My gift is that a king shall come and take her to be his wife." The girl, however, did as the little men had bid her, and swept away the snow behind the little house with a broom. And what did she find but real ripe strawberries, which came up quite dark, quite dark from out of the snow. In her joy, she hastily gathered her basket full and then thanked the little men. She shook hands with each of them and then ran home to her stepmother and what she had longed for so much. When she went inside and said good evening, a piece of gold at once fell from her mouth. Thereupon she related what happened in the wood, and with every word she spoke, gold pieces fell from her mouth until very soon the whole room was covered with them. "Now look at her arrogance," cried the stepsister, "to throw about gold in that way." But she was secretly envious of it, and wanted to go into the forest and also seek strawberries. The mother said, "No, my dear darling, it's too cold outside, and you might freeze to death." However, as her daughter let her have no peace, the mother as yet obliged, and made her a magnificent fur coat, which she was obliged to put on, and then gave her bread and butter and cake for her journey. The girl went into the forest and straight up to the little house. The little men peeped out again, but she did not greet them, and without looking round at them and without speaking to them, she awkwardly went into the room and seated herself by the stove, and began to eat her bread and butter and cake. "Give us some of it," cried the little men. She replied, "There is not enough for myself, so how can I give it away to other people?" When she had finished eating, they said, "There is a broom for you to sweep. Sweep it clean up from the front to the back door." "Sweep for yourselves," she said. "I am not a servant." When she saw they were not going to give her anything, she went out by the door. Then the little men said to each other, "What should we give her, as she is so naughty and has a wicked and envious heart, which that will never let her do one good turn for anyone?" The first said, "I grant she may grow uglier every day." The second said, "I grant that with every word she says a toad shall spring from her mouth." And the third said, "I grant that she will die a miserable death." The maiden looked for strawberries outside, but found none, and went home angrily. And when she opened her mouth to tell her mother about it, what happened to her in the wood, and with every word she said, a toad sprang from her mouth, so that everyone was seized with horror of her. Then the stepmother was still more enraged, and thought nothing about but how to do every possible injury to the man's daughter, whose beauty, however, had grown daily greater. At length she took a cauldron and set it on fire and boiled yarn in it. When it was boiled, she flung it at the poor girl's shoulder and gave her an axe in order that she might go onto the frozen river and cut a hole in the ice and rinse the yarn. She was so obedient that she went thither and cut a hole into the ice, and while she was in the midst of cutting, a splendid carriage came driving up, in which sat a king. The carriage stopped, and the king asked, "My child, who are you, and what are you doing here?" "I am a poor girl, and I am rinsing yarn." Then the king felt compassion, and when he saw that she was very beautiful, he said to her, "Will you come away with me?" "Oh, yes, with all my heart," she answered, and was glad to get away from the mother and the sister. So she went into the carriage and drove away with the king, and when they arrived at the palace, the wedding was celebrated with great pomp, and the little men were granted to the maiden. When the year was over, the young queen bore a son, and as the stepmother had heard of her great good fortune, she came with her daughter to the palace and pretended to want to pay her a visit. But when the king had gone out, no one else was present. The wicked woman seized the queen by the head, and her daughter seized her by the feet, and they lifted her out of the bed and threw her out of a window into a stream which flew by. Then the ugly daughter laid herself in the bed, and the old woman covered her up to the head. When the king came home again and wanted to speak with his wife, the old woman cried, "Shh, hush! She can't be now. She's lying there in a violent sweat. You must let her rest today." The king suspected no evil, and did not come back again until next morning. And as he talked with his wife, and she answered him, with every word a toad leaped out, whereas formerly a piece of gold had fallen. Then he asked what that could be, and the old woman said that she had gotten that from the violent sweat, and would soon lose it again. During the night, however, the scullion saw a duck swimming up to the gutter, and said, "King, what art thou doing now? Sleepest thou? Wakest thou?" And as he returned no answer to it, it said, "And my guests, what do they do?" The scullion said, "They are sleeping soundly too." Then it asked again, my what does my little baby mine?" And he answered, "It sleepeth in the cradle fine." Then she went upstairs in the form of the queen, and nursed the baby, and shook its little bed, and covered it over, and then swam away down into the gutter in the shape of a duck. She thus came for 2 nights, and on the third she said to the scullion, "Go and tell me to take the king to his sword, and swing it 3 times over me on the threshold." Then the scullion ran and told the king, and who came with his sword and swung it thrice over the spirit. And at that time his wife stood before him, strong, living, healthy as she'd been before. Thereupon the king was full of great joy, and he kept the queen hidden in his chamber until Sunday, when the baby was to be christened. When it was christened, he said, "What does a person deserve who drags another out of bed and throws him into the water?" "The wretch deserves nothing better," answered the old woman, "than to be taken into a barrel and stuck full of nails, and rolled down the hill into the water." Then the king said, "You have pronounced your own sentence," and ordered the barrel to be brought, and the old woman put into it with her daughter. And then the top was hammered on, and the barrel rolled down the hill until it went into the river.